The first time my daughter told me she was proud of me, I believed her. The second time, standing in an empty parking lot outside the banquet hall on the night that was supposed to matter most, I finally understood that pride without presence doesn't weigh very much at all. I'm going to tell you what happened on the evening I was honored after 38 years with the same fire department in Clarksburg, West Virginia. And I'm going to tell you what happened 2.5 hours after that, when my phone lit up on a sticky vinyl booth at a Waffle House on Route 50 and didn't stop for the better part of a night. Welcome, friends. If you're new here, go ahead and find a comfortable spot, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if stories like this one hit close to home for you, subscribe before we get into it. You're going to want to know how this ends. I need to start with Danny, because without Danny, none of what I'm about to tell you makes any sense at all. Danny Kowalski is my nephew. His father, my younger brother Pete, died of a stroke at 54 years old, 6 years ago this past October. Pete was a plumber. He ran his own small operation out of a white van with a cracked windshield and a hand-painted logo on the side that his wife, Lorraine, had done herself with craft paint from the dollar store. He worked 5, sometimes 6 days a week, never once complained about it, and left behind a son who watched him die in a hospital recliner during a Tuesday afternoon that neither of them saw coming. Danny was 24 when Pete died. He had been working part-time at a hardware store and taking 2 community college courses at night, trying to piece together some kind of direction. When Pete passed, there was no life insurance worth mentioning, some debt from the van and the equipment, and a mother who needed help keeping the house. Danny dropped the courses. He went full-time at the hardware store, picked up weekend shifts at a landscaping company, and didn't say a word about any of it like it was the only reasonable thing a person could do. Because for Danny, it was. I'd stop by his mother's place on Sunday afternoons sometimes, and Danny would already be out back fixing the fence or snaking the drain or resealing the driveway, things Pete would have done, things Danny just absorbed into himself because somebody had to. He never once asked me for money. Not when the furnace quit in January. Not when Lorraine's car needed a water pump. He just figured it out, every single time, the way Pete always had. There's a kind of quiet that some people carry that isn't emptiness. It's the sound of a person who has made their peace with difficulty. That was Danny. My name is Walter Gaines. I'm 63 years old. I spent 38 years with the Clarksburg Fire Department, starting as a young man of 25 who thought he understood what the job was going to ask of him, and learned within the first 6 months that he had no idea. I worked through 3 chief officers, 2 devastating structure fires that still find me in my sleep some nights, and a medical call in 2009 that I don't talk about to people who weren't there. I missed my daughter's junior prom send-off because we had a 4-alarm warehouse fire on the east side of town. I missed 2 Thanksgivings, a Christmas Eve, and her high school graduation ceremony because someone else's emergency didn't consult our family calendar. I told myself for years that missing those moments was the honest cost of serving people who needed me. I still believe that's partly true. What I didn't account for was whether my daughter was keeping score, quietly, in a way I couldn't see. That's my part in this. I own it, and I'm not going to set it down. My wife, Renata, passed 9 years ago from complications after a surgery that was supposed to be routine. She used to say that our daughter, Melissa, got her father's determination and her mother's memory for grievances, which she said with a kind of tired humor that I only understood years later. Renata had a way of seeing things clearly that I used to mistake for pessimism. I don't make that mistake anymore. On the 14th of February, which is a date I will not forget for what it now means to me beyond any greeting card, Captain Roderick Hale called me into his office and told me that the department was retiring me with a formal commendation ceremony at the Elks Lodge downtown with the fire chief, the mayor, and a local news crew from Channel 7. He said they wanted to do it right. 38 years was a long time, and the department wasn't going to mark it with a handshake and a grocery store cake. There'd be a dinner, remarks from current and former colleagues, and a commendation plaque that was going to be mounted in the station lobby permanently. My name on a wall. I sat across from Rod in that office, and I didn't say much, because I wasn't sure my voice was going to cooperate if I tried to speak too quickly. I called Melissa before I left the parking lot. I want you to understand that. Before I called my sister, before I called Pete's wife Lorraine, before I called anyone, I called my daughter. I sat in my truck and I dialed her number, and when she picked up, I told her everything Rod had just told me. I said, "Mel, they're doing a formal ceremony. The mayor's going to be there. Channel 7. I want you and Kevin sitting at my table." There was a silence on her end that had a particular shape to it, the kind that isn't people thinking, it's people deciding how to phrase something they've already decided. "Dad," she said, "that weekend is Kevin's cousin's wedding in Scottsdale." I asked about the date. It was fixed. Department ceremonies don't move around people's social calendars. She said they'd booked the flights 3 months ago. I told her this was my retirement. 38 years. She said she understood that, Dad, she really did. And that she was sorry the timing was what it was. But Kevin's family had been planning this for over a year, and it would be really hard to just not show up to a family wedding. I told her my retirement ceremony was also a family event, the only one of its kind I would ever have. She said she knew, and she was sorry. And then she said something that I want to quote to you exactly, because I have turned it over in my mind so many times since that night that the words have worn grooves. "Dad, you know how these things go. It'll be a bunch of guys from the station slapping each other on the back. You'll be fine. You always are." I told her I understood. I hung up the phone. I sat in the truck for a while. A few sparrows were working at something on the pavement near the rear tire. I watched them for longer than I probably should have. Then I started the engine and drove home. That evening I thought about Danny. I don't know exactly when he crossed my mind, somewhere between making a sandwich I didn't end up eating and standing at the living room window watching the light change. I just found myself thinking about a Sunday afternoon, 2 winters back, when I'd stopped by Lorraine's house, and Danny had been out front in 22-degree weather, fixing the porch steps with lumber he'd gotten secondhand from a demolition site because he didn't want his mother slipping on ice. I hadn't asked him to do it. Nobody had asked him to do it. He had just done it because it needed doing, and he was there. I thought about that for a long time. I called him the next morning. He picked up on the second ring. I could hear the hardware store in the background, a forklift beeping somewhere, the sound of a place that opens early for people who work with their hands. I told him about the ceremony. I told him I had a seat at the head table with his name on it if he wanted it, and that I'd understand completely if the timing didn't work out, because I meant that sincerely. He went quiet for a second. Not the kind of quiet Melissa had given me. A different kind entirely. Then he said, "Uncle Walt, I would be honored to be there. Tell me what time, and I'll be there an hour early if you need anything set up." Honored. A 30-year-old man working doubles at a hardware store and weekend landscaping shifts to keep his mother's house, and he used the word honored like it was the only one that fit. Because for Danny, it was. If you have a person in your life who shows up not because they owe you something, not because it's convenient, but simply because showing up is who they are, I want you to take a second right now and think about that person's face. This story is about to need you in their corner. The night of the ceremony, Danny arrived wearing a dark blue blazer that was a little wide in the shoulders and dress pants he'd clearly pressed himself. The crease a little sharp in the way you only get from someone who doesn't own an iron and borrowed one. He had driven 47 miles from Fairmont in a truck that I happened to know needed a new rear brake caliper because he'd mentioned it in passing 3 weeks earlier and hadn't gotten to it yet. He walked in and shook hands with Rod and the other guys, and he didn't perform a single moment of it. He just stood next to me like that was where he belonged, curious and attentive and genuinely interested in every person he met. He asked Chief Alderman questions about the 1,997 flood response that I didn't even remember telling Danny about. He remembered things. That's a specific kind of respect, when someone pays enough attention to remember what matters to you. The lodge held around 200 people. The Channel 7 crew had set up near the back with 2 cameras. Mayor Tillman gave remarks. Rod spoke for about 8 minutes and said, "Things about me I'm not going to repeat here because they made it hard to breathe, and this is already a lot for one story." I gave a short speech about the men and women I'd served beside, about the nature of a job that asks everything on some days and nothing on others, and never announces which kind of day it's going to be in advance. I talked about Pete a little, about what it means to be the kind of person who shows up. I looked once at the two chairs to my left that were empty, and then I looked at Danny, and I kept talking. That was when Fire Chief Raymond Alderman came to the podium with something in his hand I hadn't been briefed on. "Friends," he said, "38 years is not a number, it's a life. Walt Gaines has spent his adult life running toward things the rest of us run away from. And tonight we want to recognize not just that service, but what it represents." He paused for a moment. This year, the department partnered with the West Virginia Firefighters Heritage Foundation to establish a legacy award, given in the name of a retiring member to someone in their life who embodies the same values: commitment, quiet sacrifice, and showing up when it counts. We asked Walt to name that person. I had been asked to submit a name 3 weeks prior. I had submitted Danny's. I hadn't told him. Chief Alderman said Danny's full name into the microphone. Daniel Peter Kowalski. He described in brief what Danny had done since Pete died. The 2 jobs, his mother's house, the furnace, the porch steps in 22-degree weather. Then he said that in Walter Gaines's name, the Heritage Foundation was awarding Danny a vocational training grant of $40,000 to complete his plumbing certification and licensing, and a tools and equipment starter package, valued at another $12,000, so that he could carry forward his father's trade and build something of his own. The room went quiet. Then it didn't. Danny's hands were flat on the table. He was looking at me the way a person looks when they need someone to confirm that reality is what it appears to be. I nodded once because words were not available to me in that moment. He put one hand over his mouth and looked at the ceiling for a long count of 3. He didn't perform anything. He was just a young man being told that his 6 years of quiet, grinding, uncelebrated loyalty had been seen by someone. That it had meant something. When he finally looked back at me, his eyes were wet, and he said, real quietly, "Just for me, my dad would have liked you saying that." And I told him Pete already knew. We didn't stay for the full reception. Danny and I ended up an hour later at a Waffle House on Route 50 with a waitress named Darlene who refreshed our coffee without being asked, which I consider to be one of the finer qualities a person can have. We ordered hash browns and pie, and Danny kept turning his phone over in his hands like he was waiting for something to make sense. He said, more than once, "I just don't know what to do with this, Uncle Walt." Not meaning the money, meaning being chosen, meaning being seen. There is a specific kind of disorientation in receiving something you have quietly needed for a long time. I recognized it. I let him sit with it. My phone was on the table between us, screen down. At 9:52 it buzzed. I picked it up and saw 8 missed calls from Melissa. I set it back down. By 10:20 it was 19 calls. Danny noticed. He asked if everything was all right. I told him it would be. I said it with more certainty than I felt. By 10:47 it was 34 missed calls, and the texts had started. I could see them stacking up on the preview screen without opening them. Then Kevin's name appeared too, which I hadn't expected. I finally read them just after 11. Melissa's first message said, "Dad, we saw the ceremony clip on the Channel 7 Facebook page. Why is Danny getting an award at your retirement?" Her second message 4 minutes later, "That grant money should stay in the immediate family. That's not right." Kevin's was a single line. "Walt, you need to call us tonight. We need to talk about this." I sat in that Waffle House booth with the smell of coffee and butter and something on the griddle, reading the words, "That's not right," about a decision I had made publicly in front of 200 people and a television camera. As if the whole thing had been a filing error, someone could walk back with a phone call to the right department. By the time Danny dropped me at my car, it was close to midnight. The count was 51 calls. I hadn't returned a single one. I want to be honest with you about what I felt sitting there. I had expected, if this moment ever came and some part of me had known it would come in one shape or another, I had expected anger, some righteous, clarifying fury that would feel like relief. That's not what arrived. What arrived was something quieter, a kind of settling, like a house that has been shifting on its foundation for years and has finally found the position it's going to stay in. Not comfortable necessarily, but fixed. I called Melissa the next morning at 8:15. She answered, before the first ring had finished. "Dad," she said, "you have to call the Heritage Foundation and explain that Danny isn't immediate family. You can redirect the grant. They'll understand." I told her the grant wasn't redirectable, that it had been given, publicly, in my name. Then she said, "Dad, you're punishing us for going to a wedding. Kevin's family is going to think we have problems. This is embarrassing." I want you to hear that word. Embarrassing. She wasn't hurt. She was embarrassed. Those are not the same thing, and the difference between them told me more than the previous 10 years had. I told her, as calmly as I could hold myself to, "Mel, I'm not punishing you. I was asked to name the person in my life who represents what my 38 years meant." I answered honestly. "Nobody told you what to do with Kevin's cousin's wedding. You made a choice. Danny made a different choice. The foundation gave a grant based on what those choices looked like from the outside. I can't edit that, and I wouldn't if I could." She said, "So Danny matters more to you than your own daughter." I told her, "I'm not ranking people, Mel. I asked you to be at my table and you told me it would be guys slapping each other on the back. Danny drove 47 miles with a brake caliper that needed replacing because he didn't want me to be at my own retirement dinner without family. I love you, but you and Danny showed me different things that night, and I have to be honest about what I saw." She hung up. I let her. 6 weeks after the ceremony, I had a conversation with my attorney, a man named Gerald Schott, who had handled Renata's estate and had been straightforward with me through every difficulty since. He asked, given recent events, whether I wanted to revisit any of the arrangements in my will. He wasn't pushing, he was asking. I'd been sitting with the question already. There's a piece of land outside of town, 7 acres on the south side of Tanner Ridge, that Renata and I bought in 2003, when we still had plans we hadn't finished yet. We'd talked about building a small cabin on it someday. We never did. After she passed, it just sat there. I'd visit it occasionally, walk the tree line, think. Melissa had mentioned it to me exactly twice in 9 years, both times in the context of what it might be worth if the county rezoned the road access. That was her relationship with that land. I had Gerald put the Tanner Ridge parcel into a land trust with Danny as steward, not given outright. Held in trust for the family, with the understanding that Danny would manage it, and the first structure built on it would belong to him. He could put a workshop there, a proper plumbing operation with a yard for equipment. Something Pete never got to build. Something with a future in it. Melissa found out 2 months later through Gerald's office, not from me. She called on a Thursday evening. I picked up this time. Her voice was different from the calls after the ceremony. Smaller. She said, "Dad, I don't understand how we got here. I really don't. And here's what I want to tell you, friends, because this is the truest part of all of it. I don't think she was lying. I think she genuinely did not understand. And I think that lack of understanding was itself the answer to her question. And I didn't know how to explain that to her in a single phone call without it sounding like a verdict. So I just told her I loved her and that I hoped we could find our way to a different conversation sometime soon." She said, "Okay," in a voice that was trying to hold itself together. We hung up. I sat on my back porch for a long time after that with my coffee going cold, watching the yard go dark. I thought about Pete, about the kind of father he was, always in motion, always fixing something, never once needing to be thanked out loud because the work itself was the language he spoke. And I thought about the son Pete left behind, who had learned that same language fluently and never asked for a translator. Danny got his plumbing certification 4 months after the ceremony. He named his business KP Plumbing and Mechanical for Kowalski and Pete, the K and the P. His mother cried when she saw the lettering on the van. It was a white van, same as Pete's, and if you look at it from a certain angle in a certain light, I defy you to tell me the universe doesn't occasionally get something exactly right. He put my name in the acknowledgments on his business license documentation, in the line for person who made this possible. I found that out from Lorraine, not from Danny, because Danny doesn't announce things. He just does them. and moves forward. Melissa and I talk sometimes now. Not as easily as I'd like. Not as often. She hasn't brought up Tanner Ridge again, and I haven't raised it either. There's a version of the future I'm still holding space for, where we find our way back to something easier. I don't know yet if that version arrives. What I do know is that I've stopped pretending the difficulty between us doesn't exist, and I've stopped waiting for a single moment to dissolve it, because in my experience, the things that build up slowly don't clear up fast. What I have instead is this. I know who shows up for me. I know it with the kind of certainty that doesn't require maintenance or reassurance or revisiting. Danny calls on Sundays. Sometimes we talk for an hour, sometimes for 4 minutes because he's got a job to get to and I've got somewhere to be, but he calls. Last March, he drove out to Tanner Ridge with me on a Saturday morning, and we walked the tree line together, and he pointed to a flat section near the east end and said, "Uncle Walt, that's where I'd put the bay doors if I was building something here." And I said, "That sounds about right to me." And we stood there in the cold for a while. Two people with no particular obligation to each other, except the kind that gets built out of showing up, looking at 7 acres of quiet possibility. Pete would have liked that afternoon. I'm certain of it. He would have had a thermos of bad coffee and a lot of opinions about the drainage situation near the tree line, and he would have been exactly right about all of it. I miss him every time I'm up there. I suspect I always will. But here's what I want to leave you with tonight, friends, before we wrap this up. You get to decide what loyalty means in your life. Not who was born into your family. Not who carries your last name. Not who you assumed would be standing next to you. You get to decide, one choice at a time, which people get the weight of your trust, and that decision is allowed to be based entirely on who actually shows up, not who was supposed to. Don't wait for a ceremony and a news crew and 51 missed calls to figure out who those people are. You probably already know. Think about the one person in your life who shows up quietly, consistently, without needing to be asked twice. The one who drove 47 miles on bad brakes, who fixed the porch steps in the cold, who picked up the phone on the second ring. Go tell them something true. Don't wait for the right moment. The right moment is always right now, and it always passes faster than you think. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me about your Danny. Or if you want to be honest, tell me about the times you were someone else's Melissa. I think that comment would mean just as much. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this if someone needs to hear it. And I'll see you in the next one.